off Maxey.
Gary Snyder Chris.
Out to Chase Berry for three. Rebound by Peyton Crispin. He's going to put it back. And
he got it!
The Lakers hit a three.
So welcome back again. Music Court, home of your SWOCC Lakers.
Can't get the shot to go. The Lakers win the ball game. Go! Lakers win! Lakers win in overtime. 108-106.
Congratulations, you just got accepted into college. Now, how do you pay for it? Fortunately, there are several options out there to consider. Follow this simple step-by-step guide as you figure out how to pay for college. Step 1, fill out your FAFSA? Free application for federal student aid, FAFSA. Your FAFSA will determine if you qualify for financial aid, including grants, some scholarships, work-study, and federal student loans. The good news is, most people qualify for some financial aid, which is why this is the most important step in figuring out how to pay for college. Step 2, figure out how much you may need to borrow by weighing your college costs versus your contributions, including any grants or scholarships. Some easy arithmetic will make your math teachers proud. Let's say your college of choice costs $30,000 a year after factoring in tuition, housing, books, lab fees, and a laptop. Now, let's pretend that the money found in your family swear jar, your bowling scholarship, your federal grant, and the money you saved as a scuba instructor contributes $10,000 to your college fund. Voila! This is how much you will need to cover through other means. Many families consider student loans a reliable option. Step 3. There are two categories of student loans you can consider, federal and private. Federal loans are made by the government and private loans are made by private lenders. In some cases, families use both to cover the cost of college. Compare student loan options by looking at their interest rates, repayment options, and fees. Interest rates vary depending on the loan type. Federal loan rates are fixed, while private loan rates can be fixed or variable and are determined by your credit quality. Adding a co-signer, like mom and dad, may help lower your interest rate. Repayment options for federal and private loans are also different. Some providers require in-school payments, some don't. Take a look at these now and choose an option that makes sense for you. Watch out for fees. Fees can be charged upfront or in repayment, and they add to the total cost of the loan, so you end up paying more back. Step 4. Factor in other benefits when researching a loan. Some reduce your interest rate and some give you cash back. For example, Discover student loans have no fees and give you a cash reward for a 3.0 GPA or equivalent. Let's go through these steps one more time, just in case you needed a refresher. Step 1, fill out your FAFSA. Step 2, weigh your school cost versus your contributions. Maximize any free money like personal savings, grants, and scholarships before considering loans. Step 3, compare interest rates, repayment options, and fees. Step 4, take into account any benefits the loan provider may offer. Don't forget that you can continue to reduce the amount you need to borrow with scholarships. If you are an eligible current or college-bound student, you can enter to win a $2,500 Discover Student Loan Scholarship Award. Head over to collegecovered.com to learn more about paying for college and enter to win. No purchase or loan required. The first week of school can always be a bit overwhelming, but a little bit of good old college ingenuity can go a long way. Here are 10 collegiate quality hacks that will make campus life a little more comfortable.
Do you like to work with metal, fire, electricity? Would you like to make money doing it? At Southwestern, we can help make your dream a reality. With our degree and certificate programs in welding, you'll be prepared for a career in the welding and fabrication industry in as little as a year. Check out our website and let Southwestern spark your career in welding today.
I'm Private First Class Taylor Irwin, and I'm with the Maryland Army National Guard. I joined the Army National Guard to begin my career. I have been awarded tuition assistance, and I picked furthering my education. Right now we're just going through the basics. We're doing the confidence course. It's to get over your fears basically and to see how far your team has come. It takes a strong leader and strong drill sergeants as well. You're gonna meet some really cool people and they're gonna help you get through it either way. So it's gonna be really fun.
This is Southwestern's dental assisting program. In just one short year, you could be a dental assistant. Sign up now for your one-year dental assisting certification.
Hi, my name is Ron Metzger and I've been teaching geology at Southwestern Oregon Community College for the last 20 years. It's an exciting time to be teaching in the health and science fields at SWOCC as we work towards funding a new health and science facility at the college. Colito Hall is the building I work in and it houses our science labs. It was constructed in 1965 and the labs have undergone relatively little updating since that time. Over the years, we faculty have provided an exceptional foundation in the lab sciences. It's relatively easy to see how an investment in the health side of the facility will pay dividends in our local communities. The added lab and class space will allow additional cohorts of nursing students and new programs. This will allow our local residents to go through the programs and earn family wage jobs at Bay Area Hospital and all of our other local healthcare providers. As we look forward, it'll be interesting to see what we accomplish as a college and community with lab facilities and equipment equal to the task of teaching in the 21st century. I hope you will work with me as we move forward with this project. I hope you will work with me as we move forward with this project.
Big me. I've really been hoping that Big Me could go away and we would have already dug a hole and started construction. How many of you wonder what's going on with that project? Those of you that have gotten used to me know that I don't usually use notes, which isn't always a good thing. Health science building update. Holding pattern. Not our fault. Now, all the poor folks that are out there that haven't gotten paid for weeks and weeks in this government shutdown thing, which I was told went on short pause today, is very good for them. Unfortunately, due to the government shutdown, federal monies that we have through an EDA grant worth several millions of dollars, which is kind of tough. We've raised a lot of money, but a few $1,000,000 is still a few $1,000,000. And several other agencies have been shut down with the government shutdown. Guess where our stuff is sitting? Yeah. So we've got final approval. We basically need final approval for a contract from the last bid. A bunch of you are going to wonder who that bidder was. I am allowed to say a firm out of K Falls with lots of local subs. That's the status. I am going to bet money. Well, not really, but I'm going to bet that probably 3 weeks of non-government shutdown, we don't get it done, but hopefully they'll figure it out and we'll be able to move on. Some of you that are very astute may have noticed, if you have one of these on your fridge, please take a new one. The March speaker went from March 2nd to March 16th. I talked to her on the phone. She sounds very, very nice. I think she's going to be an incredibly engaging speaker. If you show up on March 2nd, it will be an empty hall. If you did not sign one of these, if you would take a few moments on your way out and sign one, I would appreciate it. It helps justify keeping these things free. If you did not, speaking about keeping these things free, if you did not pick up a copy of Dr. Jones's The Big Ones, please consider doing such on the way out. $25, the proceeds go to support the lecture series that you are attending this evening. And also, if you would like to be a minion, please feel free to pick up some posters and take them to other places. Now, one other mildly geologic point, Ice Age the movie, how many of you like that? Awesome. Ice Age the movie, our South Coast Education Service District is having a free community appreciation showing at 2 p.m. on Sunday. There is one downside to that. You actually have to show up and listen to me for 10 to 12 minutes, talk about Ice Age stuff. And more importantly, I will have a bunch of fossils for the kids to look at, touch, some of them afterwards out in the lobby as well. We're also going to be able to, nope, it's at the Egyptian Theater. And for kids under 12, they're going to have 50 copies of a book called Everybody Needs a Rock. Now, you can maybe take a guess who helped with that. Would be my darling wife, who got me a copy, and I said, this would be a great book if you're trying to give books away to kids to get them to read. So, anyway, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Lucy Jones. How many of you remember when we used to get information on those weird little boxes called televisions that had ABC, NBC, CBS, and that was about it? I remember a few years ago, it wasn't very long for either of us, I believe, watching morning shows, and Dr. Jones would be there and would be telling me and Kathy about all the things that were disastrous going on in this country and around the planet. And I watched that, and it was very intriguing. How many of you had similar memories? You have an association seeing a disaster. I know a few of you told me in the lobby the calming effect in Southern California associated with disasters. And I think that one of the things, and this is the 14th annual Cascadia anniversary talk, when I first moved here 23 years ago, large earthquakes in this region were not very well known among members of the community. There were folks that knew that this type of activity could take place, but a majority of people didn't know. And I know that most of you are the choir and you all know these things and have been coming to these events for quite a while. But one of the things over the 23 years that I've been here is that we've transitioned from a period of awareness to slowly starting to get into a preparedness thing. And the resiliency, the great shakeout drill, all of the things that Dr. Jones is associated with in her stellar career, I could spend the rest of the evening talking about. I will stop there. Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you, Dr. Jones, for coming and presenting to us tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me up here, and thank you for coming up with such incredible weather. I was sort of thinking I might want to try to do some storm watching, but it's a lot nicer to be able to get out and walk down the beach. What I want to talk to you tonight about, obviously, is going to be about disasters. But what I'm trying to do is to help look at disasters as part of human life, part of human history, and hopefully shift a bit about the way you think about the disasters. And the first point that's really important to make is that natural disasters are natural. They are part of the natural processes that make our world and make our world a livable place. I mean, every time you get to have a river like this that brings in recreation, but also transportation and food, at some point you're also going to have a river that looks like this. We have to have our cities near rivers, and yet it means that we're going to be having floods. Even things like the San Francisco Bay, that is there because the San Andreas and Hayward faults split apart in the area between drops down. Many of the features that make for good harbors come from earthquakes. Los Angeles is where it is because the faults that run through the area trapped oil, and people came and settled as we discovered the oil at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, a little closer to home, you might think that there isn't a great reason for being near volcanoes, except for the fact that the lava that gets produced and comes out over the area turns out to be very rich, create very rich and fertile soil. And relatively speaking, volcanoes are a place that have better crops. So everything that you're going to be having here is going to be, much of what makes your life worthwhile and works comes from the same natural processes that create our natural disasters. So instead of thinking about how do we avoid them, we really do need to be thinking about how do we live with them. And when we think about them, to emphasize just how natural they are, it is fundamentally about heat. When you look at the meteorologic disasters, you're looking at the water cycle, the transmittal of energy by the evaporation of water out of the oceans, coming over as clouds, turning it into rain. Again, what makes the land fertile and able to support life and crops is a generation of heat. When you look at the geologic hazards, we also are looking at instances of heat. That deep in the earth is producing heat because of radioactive decay. That heat needs to get dissipated. And just like when you pour cream into a cup of coffee and you get a little cycle going to mix the hot and the cold materials, the same thing goes on in the earth on a much longer time scale. So we have convection cells that take the deep heated material deep in the earth, brings it up to the surface at a mid-ocean ridge, creates the plates which then move out, cooling off, and when they go down in the subduction zones, we are now putting cool rock down. So in the end, all of these are about heat and the movement of heat and the dissipation of heat. When I thought about how to put together the talk for here, I thought about all the time I could spend talking about the Cascadia subduction zone. My guess is most of the people in this room have heard some of that before. Yeah, you've been coming to these lectures for a long time, so I won't try to preach that much to the choir. But you've got this issue, and hopefully you know that they also are the reason that the Pacific Northwest is so beautiful. Right? You have your volcanoes because of the melting along the subducting slab. You have the coast range because of the deformation that comes behind the trench. So all of this is part of this natural process, and of course, unfortunately, on average, about every 500 years or so, and you can argue how you define it, you get your big earthquake. And you've got to be ready for that. And to be honest, you guys have a harder problem than we do in California. We have reminders. We haven't had enough recently. Actually, we've had a really quiet time, and it's been 25 years since the Northridge earthquake, which is the last really significant one. But it's a lot easier to get seismic codes through your legislature when they've experienced the damage, when they've watched somebody die, when they know somebody who was injured, than it is when you go, well, really, the scientists say this is absolutely true sometime in the next few centuries, right? I realize that that's a much harder place to get to than what we have with the more regular earthquakes. And of course, the other big issue, as we're talking about multiple hazards, is the fact that you actually have that subduction zone. And I don't know how much aware you are, really subduction zones are the only places that create the big tsunamis. You can get a smaller tsunami by having an underwater landslide and something related, but it's this process of the megathrust accumulating stress and releasing it over a big enough area. Because to get that really big tsunami, you need to move a really big amount of water. And it's the subduction zones that produce the really long faults. I mean, we have some thrust faults off of Southern California that'll produce, maybe 30 kilometers. You guys have, approaching 1,000 kilometers. And that means you've got 30 times as much water getting moved at the same time. So you are the only ones in the lower 48 that need to really worry about the big tsunamis, from Northern California up to British Columbia. Of course, Alaska has them too, but the other places, you can find plenty of people in Southern California really terrified of tsunamis. I get people asking me about the tsunami risk in Pasadena. We are at 600 feet above sea level, right? And yeah. But for you guys, this is a rational risk, and we can talk later if you want about exactly what you do. I hope everyone here knows, feel strong shaking, head up. Beyond that, that's probably the most important thing that you can do. But one of the other points here, notice that I'm talking about it, you have the only risk. Disasters are fundamentally spatially predictable. We know where they are going to happen. This is the National Seismic Hazard Map created by the U.S. Geological Survey. There's a variety of ways in which the same information can be portrayed, but fundamentally we're talking about how often you get bad shaking, right? We know where the faults are. It doesn't mean it's impossible to have an earthquake on the East Coast. And in fact, you've got that little green spot in the middle of Virginia. That's where it produced the mineral earthquake in 2011 that caused damage in Washington, D.C. So even those lower level areas of risk are ones that we have recognized. Right? Now, the last thing I want to talk about, the spatially predictable part, and what risks we have is, I know you're worried about the earthquake, or at least, very aware of it. You're aware of the tsunami. You need to make sure you don't forget about rain. And I'm saying that, and people go, who's afraid of the rain, right? But that's a psychological aspect, that because we can see it coming, it is less frightening than that earthquake and tsunami. But the atmospheric rivers of the western U.S., you probably have started to hear about them. They were really only defined within the last 20 years when they got satellites that could show us the actual moisture content of the air, and we started seeing these features like this with huge amounts of moisture coming in. Those storms we get that last for days and really dump everything on us, they are in fact as deadly as many of the earthquake risks. You've got a big enough earthquake risk, you probably need to make sure you really think about that one too. But we can't go and look at it to the exclusion of all else. In Southern California, we've killed more people with rain-related events from landslides and debris flows and floods than we have from earthquakes, even for all that high level of earthquakes we have. And these type of disasters, unfortunately, are likely to be increasing. The climate is changing. This is the average temperature of the world from 1860 to the current time. The temperature has gone up significantly. And what is heat? Heat is energy. That means there is now more energy in the atmosphere to contribute to storms. So the expectation as the heat continues to rise is that we are going to see an increased number of severe storms, and those are going to be something that we have to take progressively more seriously. The good news is climate change can't affect earthquakes. Right? The earthquakes are generated deep in the earth. The change of a degree at the surface of the earth doesn't change what's going on 10, 20, 50 kilometers down. But for all of these disasters, even though they are spatially predictable, they are temporally random. Right? So when you think about when should something happen, let's go back to earthquakes and talk about when earthquakes can happen. We often want to think of them as a normal distribution, which would be the one on the left, that there's some likely time that the earth is accumulating the stress until it overcomes the friction and it breaks. So it's less likely now, more likely time in the future, and less likely that it'll go a really long time before you have it. Right? And this is the same sort of temporal distribution we get for storms, right? You hear I just heard somebody say the rain's going to be coming back on Tuesday, right? We see that storm developing in the ocean and we predict when it's going to arrive, and it might come, travel faster or slower and be a little earlier or a little later, but it's a time in the future, and it looks like that distribution on the left. So we're trained to think about the distribution that way, and we often think that the earthquakes should be like that. They don't have to be. There's other types of distributions that you could have. And it's a pretty hard thing to know because who was here? Nobody was here in this, probably, well, no, there are a few, Native Americans, we don't have written records for even the last earthquake. What about the 10 before? What pattern do they make? And this is where we turn to geology. And we are getting progressively better data in what's called paleoseismology, going in and digging into a fault, hard to do offshore. But for those of us on land in San Andreas, we can get in and dig into it, and we can get records. And the carbon-14 dating is getting quite a bit better recently. And there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago with really good data about this. And what you see is that for the site on the San Andreas with 11 intervals, the average time between events is 100 years, but 3 of them have been less than 50 years apart, and 1 of them is closer to 350 years apart. This is not a normal distribution. It's only 11 data points. That makes it harder to try and work it out, but we can say this does not fit with the normal distribution, and in fact, probably the best fit to it is what's called a Poissonian distribution, which is defined as being the time since the last event doesn't matter. Right? And that can't be true, right? You got to build up stuff on the fault. Except it appears that we don't. And what we are thinking is probably going on for earthquakes is that there's always enough stress to have some level of earthquake, and what matters is whether you get an instability. And every year has got the same probability of creating that instability, and once the instability gets going, it'll move on and create the big earthquake. That's still a pretty debated area, we aren't sure, but don't believe someone that goes, oh, well, they're only every 500 years and it's been 300. Or that new data from Southern Oregon, that's what is it, every 250 years, and it's been 300. Oh my heavens, it must be due, right? No. Even in Southern California, we're now over 300 years since earthquake on the southernmost part of the San Andreas Fault, and I still think that the best description is a Poissonian distribution. It means they're random, and that means that we hate it. Human beings cannot stand the random distribution. We are actually evolved to create patterns and to not believe in randomness. Think about how we came to develop our intelligence, right? Evolving out of the other great apes, being out on the savanna, the ability to look at a movement in the grass and hypothesize that that meant a hidden predator gave us an evolutionary advantage in a world where it was the other animals that had the bigger teeth, the stronger muscles. We used our brain and our ability to make patterns to survive. And this was a really important evolutionary advantage when we could, for instance, hypothesize the relationship between the mushrooms you just ate and the gastrointestinal distress you're now suffering. That's allowing us to not make the mistake again. So very deep in our DNA is the belief in patterns, the hunt for patterns, and the rejection of randomness. The problem is we now find patterns even when they don't exist, right? We find patterns in the stars. We find patterns in a lot of places. We find patterns, I know people who find patterns in the clouds before earthquakes, or actually even in the trails that a slug leaves in her driveway and future earthquakes. People will try to form a pattern, especially at a time when we are at risk. When you think about disasters, have you ever thought about the word? It actually first shows up in Shakespeare, and it means ill-starred, disaster. And it represents our belief that disasters happen because fate is against us. Our fate is written in the stars. There's a reason that we're having this, because we don't want to accept that there really is no pattern at all. You know, if you go back in human history, go back to the Roman Empire as they faced Mount Vesuvius. This is actually a picture from current time, the city of Naples, talking about putting yourself at risk from a volcano. In ancient times, you know, they saw, one generation would be perfectly fine, the next one farming in the same area gets hit by the volcano. Why does this happen? And they would hypothesize that it was getting in the way of the gods. Their model was of the pagan gods, these were selfish, capricious beings who would fight with each other and do whatever, and the disasters would happen and the poor human beings just got in the way of them fighting. That's probably a pretty good reflection of what life is like in old Roman society. You know, the peasants getting in the way of the powerful people and getting squashed along the way. Vesuvius was supposed to erupt every time that Venus cheated on Vulcan and he had a male hissy fit. That was his way of complaining about it. Right? So they had an explanation, but it wasn't a particularly satisfying one. Of course, in AD 79, Mount Vesuvius did erupt in what's called a Plinian eruption. This is a picture of a Plinian eruption actually from Alaska. I don't have a camera back in AD 79. And it's called this because in that eruption that destroyed Pompeii, there was a man named Pliny the Elder who was the head of the Roman fleet who observed this and documented. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, wrote it all down. Actually, Pliny the Elder died in the eruption. And therefore, we have this description, and he described it as nothing so much as like a pine tree. And you can see what happens is the eruption, the gases force the cloud up, and then it travels out and starts collapsing down. When this happened back in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, after the Plinian eruption, they got what is called a pyroclastic flow. Again, the palm trees, this is not Mount Vesuvius, this is a picture from Mount Pinatubo. And this is this phase that after that eruption goes up, the gases get so heavy that they start flowing down, right? Without the explosive power behind it. So this cloud is volcanic ash, superheated gases traveling at 30 to 50 miles an hour and something around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. What they think happened in Pompeii was that first they had that Plinian eruption, and actually a lot of people got very scared as the sky turned black and rocks were falling out of the sky, and they got up and left. In fact, Pliny the Younger escaped with his mother and described going through the darkness as saying, we all believed that the world was coming to an end, but took some small or that my end was coming, but took a small solace knowing that the rest of the world was going with me. In fact, he didn't die, the world didn't die, he made it to Rome and gave us our record that we're able to use. However, some people said, there's rocks falling on your head out there, I think I'm safer in my home, and they stayed, and then when the pyroclastic flow came through, they were trapped in their houses, and of course that picture that we see from Pompeii is of the people who were trapped, that got hit by that pyroclastic flow. One of the reasons they think it was a pyroclastic flow is the contorted positions is actually probably instantaneous death followed by heat shock in the cadavers because it's 500 degrees Fahrenheit gas that comes through. I'm bringing this up to make a general point about disasters, which is you're probably going to live through it. Even in Pompeii, we can tell from tax records that 90% of the people got out. Right? Even in Pompeii, it's only 10% that died. And because of the randomness, because of the fear that generates in us, we are very afraid of dying. And we need to instead be afraid of what living is like afterwards and move beyond that moment and think about disasters in a longer time frame. I'm going to go back to that idea that the Romans thought it was Venus, Vulcan's temper tantrum. The Jewish Christian tradition said, no, God is good. God is somebody you can make a covenant with. He's not going to just capriciously hit you down. So if you get hit by a disaster, it must be your fault, right? And the way we intellectually reconciled that was to say, God sends these disasters as punishment for our sins. Every culture in the world has a flood tradition. It's a specifically Western tradition that turns it into the victim's fault. And this became the basis of Western thought about it for many, many centuries. And it only began to get shifted with the earthquake that hit Lisbon in 1755. So Lisbon in 1755 was the fourth largest city of Europe. It was fabulously wealthy because of the diamonds and gold that were coming in from Brazil. And Portugal was a major colonial power until this earthquake hit. You probably never thought about it, but Portugal went from being this major player colonizing around the world to pretty well disappearing from the world stage. And this earthquake was a large part of it. It was 8.7. It was probably a subduction zone earthquake, much like what you have, a bit farther offshore. It produced a tsunami. This is a painting from the time showing the tsunami coming up the river into Lisbon. And it destroyed much of the city. And what wasn't destroyed in the earthquake and tsunami burned down over the next few days. Because the earthquake began at 9:40 in the morning on All Saints' Day. Now, Portugal was an extremely devout Catholic country. 3% of the population lived in either a convent or monastery. And it was in the middle of the Inquisition. Right? So everybody, all of the devout were in churches. I know there were several services through the day. This was the biggest one of the day. All of the churches collapsed. Most of the people who were in the churches did not get out. Also, the candles on all of the altars then toppled over and helped get all of the fires going. The whorehouses, on the other hand, up on the hill, made of wood, not in the river sediment, did pretty well. And this led to some pretty big philosophical debates across Europe. For the philosophers, it's actually a rather famous time. Voltaire wrote something called the Poem on the Lisbon Disaster, and can you then impute a sinful deed to babes who on their mothers' bosoms bleed? Absolutely rejecting the idea of divine retribution as the cause of the earthquake, that there's no way you can believe in a God that would kill the babies that had no role within this. But that happened in the intellectual side. He ended up in a big debate with Rousseau, who was really against urban living at that point and espousing naturalism. And he said, no, clearly it was the mistake these people made by choosing to live in the city that caused them to be at risk from this. There's some aspect of that. The city definitely concentrated the damage. He then went on to say, as you don't know what worse fate they might have suffered if they hadn't died that day, which you really wonder what he thought about cities, that the Lisbon earthquake was a lesser fate. But this also only happened in the intellectual side. On the less intellectual part of the community, it was pretty straightforward. There's a lot of sermons from that time on the Catholic side saying, clearly we haven't prosecuted the Protestants enough, let's go burn a few more of them at the stake. But on the Protestant side, they also then said, what more proof do we need that the Inquisition is the devil's work? And in fact, the Dutch government was asked for aid. Its ambassador to Lisbon, to Portugal, asked for aid for the country. And the response of the very Calvinist government of the Netherlands at the time was that God has decreed how Lisbon should suffer, and it is not our place to change what God has decreed. So it had a lot of very human impacts to this idea, but it shows you the degree to which this idea permeated Western society. And it's really only the Lisbon earthquake that began, you can trace the beginning of seismology back to this, because until that time, it was so obvious that the earthquake was unseen, struck out of the blue, was clearly just God's work. And it was this that shook that belief enough to get people to start studying why the earthquakes were happening. And before you think that this is something special just to Western society, let me tell you what went on in Japan in the Kanto earthquake. This happened in 1923. It was right, the fault was a dipping fault, right? Just like your Cascadia subduction zone comes out to the surface out in the ocean but dips down underneath you. So we're sitting on top of it here. This fault dipped down under Tokyo, and Tokyo and Yokohama were literally sitting on top of this fault. 60% of Tokyo and 80% of Yokohama were destroyed in this earthquake. It also triggered massive fires, and about 40,000 people of the 140,000 who died were burnt to death within a building where they were trapped in it. And one of the few survivors was quoted as saying, "If this were not hell, where would hell be?" So this is a very, it was one of the most damaging earthquakes in Japanese history. And they had a very strong tradition for how to explain it. It came out of the Confucian tradition. There's actually a book written in 200 BC describing how the emperor's behavior sets off natural disasters. Because in this idea of a yin-yang balance, the emperor sits between heaven and earth, and disruption in yin-yang imbalance in court will get reflected with a yin-yang imbalance in the world. And since the yang is male, representing the emperor, the yin is female, earth, representing the ministers or women, you would get an earthquake because the yang was too weak and the yin, the earth, could overpower the sky. Too strong an emperor gives you hurricanes. Too weak an emperor gives you earthquakes, or the causes where the emperor's about to die, the ministers have usurped the emperor's power, or there are women in government. This was actually used against Jiang Qing when Mao died a month after the Tangshan earthquake. So it's an idea that's very deeply ingrained in their society, just as God's retribution is ingrained in our society. At the time of the 1923 Kanto earthquake, they had a particular problem in that the emperor was so ill. His son had been acting as Prince Regent for the last 2 years, and he hadn't been seen in public for over 4 years. The prime minister, who was another source of government masculine power in Japanese society, had just died from natural causes a week before the earthquake, and there was no prime minister. So everything about their tradition was pushing them to say, this is the government's fault, and the government stood at quite a significant risk of being overthrown. At the same time, Japan was in transition, moving towards a much more modern society. You had scientists that were telling you, the earthquakes were happening because of faults, but that also hadn't done them any good in protecting them from this event. What ended up happening is a weird distortion as people moved to protect themselves and try to manage this fear. They turned on their neighbors. And at the time, there were Koreans living in the Japanese, there were about 20,000 Koreans in Yokohama and Tokyo, and they were accused of poisoning wells and setting off the fires and causing the problems of the earthquakes. And people turned on them, and 6,000 were slaughtered by their neighbors in the next few days. And this is not to say how awful Japan is. I think we need to look at this as a human action that our most, I already had that up there. Our most constant response to disaster is blame. We want the pattern, and we need to find someone to blame, to say this can't come and happen to me again. We do, think about how we turned on FEMA after Katrina. Not to say they didn't do bad things, but it got a little out of proportion in what was being attributed to them. And this is really one of the most common things. And as you look at preparedness, we need to look about how do we keep ourselves from turning on each other afterwards. I want to go back to Lisbon for a moment, just to look at one other lesson to be learned. Lisbon actually recovered remarkably quickly because of the prime minister. His name was the Marques de Pombal, and he had a lot of power at the time. The king was not particularly interested in governing and pretty much left him to do it. The king was out of town, was in his summer palace when the earthquake hit, so he wasn't trapped in one of those churches. The Marques got out to him the day of the earthquake, and the story is that the king saw him and cried out, "What can we do about this act of divine retribution?" And the Marques replied, "Sire, we bury the dead and we feed the living," which to me is the most succinct statement of emergency management I think I've ever heard, And that is still what we need to do in that response. And the Marques went out and did it. And he shut the gates of the city. He didn't allow anybody to run away so that he would still have people to help do the rebuilding. He, within 1 month, had plans before the king about how to repair the city. And one of the issues, do we start completely over? Do we try to patch whatever up? He had 4 levels of plans. They had enough aid. The Dutch had turned them down, but the British said okay. And they rebuilt the city. And that's why Lisbon is the only major European capital that's in a rectilinear pattern, because it was completely rebuilt after that earthquake, with wide streets so that firefighting could get through, and with buildings that are called Pombaline style after the Marques, that were the first earthquake-resistant buildings. They made scale models of the building, put them out, and had the cavalry ride their horses around the buildings to cause shaking into them and see how they would respond. Right? So, let's see, I hope I have this. Yes, this is my next lesson. The disaster is really about the recovery. Our fear of randomness keeps us focused on that one moment of the event. But what's really at stake is what happens in the time afterwards. Right? So what do I mean by recovery? Let's think, I'm going to give you a little bit of an economic model here about what happens. Think about it. We have an expected level of economic activity that we hope grows with time. If it doesn't, we call it a recession, right? So we have some gradual growth with time. But at the time of the disaster, we disrupt, we damage things, we lose wealth, but we also disrupt the economy, right? If you break the water pipes, your restaurant can't reopen, your beauty salon can't reopen. If you don't have electricity, you not only can't open up your businesses, you can't get down the street when you no longer have traffic lights. You get gridlock that can come along with this. So there's a lot of things that happen because of both the direct losses in the event and the disruption of the infrastructure. Hopefully, we recover pretty quickly. You get the electricity back, you get the water back, people with damaged buildings hire contractors, they hire subcontractors, and you can really get the economic engine up and moving again if you invest resources quickly. We sometimes jokingly call this the Northridge model. That was a time when we had a FEMA that threw money at the problem. The first checks were cut to some California cities 12 hours after the earthquake, right? And that money got moving, that money got the economy going, and we recovered. We really got back to where we'd been within a year or two after that earthquake. It doesn't have to happen this way, we call it a catastrophe if you don't do enough right away, or if too many people have moved away and aren't there to help recover. You then can't get that engine going again, and you slump down into a depression. And just compare the areas under these curves, and you can see how much more money there is to be lost in a delayed recovery than there is in the event itself. And if you think I'm making this up, here's the actual GDP data from New Orleans and Nashville. Okay. Starting at 2002, going to 7 years after Hurricane Katrina. Before Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans had a more robust economic activity, a slightly larger economic activity than Nashville. They're only a few hundred miles apart, same sort of regional impact on the areas. $80 billion was lost directly in the hurricane, but there's $105 billion in lost GDP just in the next 7 years. And this is more than money, this is really people. Here's the population of New Orleans in the same time frame. Right? It is now a third smaller than it was before. It'll probably never get back to the previous size. It probably shouldn't get back to the previous size. They were built, a lot of those, the Ninth Ward and places were not places we should have anybody living. But it's a permanent change to the community. You can look at San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and see a similar sort of phenomenon. You can really argue that it got back the financial status it had. Well, it never got back the status of being the financial center of the West Coast. That really did move to LA with the earthquake. But really Silicon Valley was necessary to really get the economy back up to the level it had been before the 1906 earthquake. So when we think about this, what we're really talking about is urban society and whether or not we have a community that comes back after the event. Right? It's whether or not you can function. If too many of the services are disrupted here after the event, will you just give up and leave? How many people will stay here and be rebuilding the economy? One way to think about this is to think about a city as a system of systems. That when we build a city, the first thing we do is put in water pipes under the ground. Then we never think about them again. They're really hard to get money to repair them because nobody wants to ever think about that. And the sewer pipes that are down there. On top of those pipes, we go and we build the houses that we live in, the buildings that we're working in, our manufacturing, our power systems, our transportation system, our communication system. So a city, even a small one, is a network, is a system of these systems that are necessary to keep life functioning here. And they're based on a set of critical infrastructure. We need to have water, we need to have power, we need in our modern life to have communication, cell phone and towers, and we need buildings to live in. These are all necessary components to be able to stay here and keep things working. And on that, we build the network of things that make a community, that have our supply chains, our transportation, our emotional well-being. Why are we here and what are we doing? So what we are trying to do as we do disaster preparedness is to figure out how do we make that center strong enough that we can keep supporting our systems. It doesn't need to be perfect. Let's imagine you lose a bunch of office buildings, but you've still got internet. There's probably a bunch of people who can telecommute and keep their jobs while those buildings are being repaired. Or you lose water, but you've got transportation. There are plans in the federal government of how to get water to disaster areas that will be brought in when these happen. The thing is you can't depend on that forever. There's only so much water they bring in. So how do we speed up recovery? How do we make sure we go on the recovery path and not the catastrophe path? Number one, we do mitigation. We make sure that things that could be prevented from being damaged, we do, at least on a cost-effective level, right? There are some things that just cost too much. They aren't worth it when it's that far along, and they're not so destructive. But you don't want your hospital coming down during the earthquake. That's one of those things that you really need to mitigate and make there, and reducing the need to add that level of response. Right? The other thing is to remember is that planning improves both the response and the recovery. And the faster your response is, the quicker you're getting into recovery. You know, Dwight Eisenhower was famously quoting as saying, you know, plans are useless, but planning is essential, right? What actually will happen in your earthquake is probably not what you're planning for. Things will be different. But the process of working together to be ready for it means you have a community that's going to be able to do this, that's going to get that better response and get its recovery moving more quickly. I want to end with a couple of more stories from some of these other disasters for a couple of more lessons. This is the Loki craters of Iceland. It erupted in 1783. It is arguably the most catastrophic disaster in human history because so many aerosols got up into the stratosphere. It cooled the world. It caused a famine in Europe that helped contribute to the French Revolution. It caused famines in Egypt, India, and Japan as the cooling disrupted the monsoon process. The Nile didn't flood. They lost a sixth of the population of Egypt in the following famine. Right? And there was, when this happened in Iceland, the communities actually directly affected were quite small. One of them was led by their pastor, who was called Jon Steingrímsson. And Pastor Jon is called the fire priest. He was famous for having brought the congregation together to preach one last sermon before they abandoned the town because the lava was heading towards them. He preached apparently a pretty long sermon. And during it, the lava got stopped and never came into the town. And they actually think now that the lava hit a river that was enough that it froze the lava before it completely evaporated into steam, and it created a dam that diverted the lava from coming into the region. But so what he's known for is having preached the fire mass and stopping the lava in its tracks. The reality is when you read the records through there, he then spent the next 2 years taking care of his community, providing medical care, burying all the people that needed to be buried, because people weren't dying from being hit by lava. They were dying from poisonous gases put out by the volcano, fluorine and sulfur dioxide that destroyed the crops, just poisoned all of the crops that were on land, killed all of the livestock. People who ate the dead livestock then died themselves from fluorine poisoning. And he struggled for 2 years to hold his community together, and they eventually made it through. And it's really an inspiring story to me to watch how one person can really make a difference. And that's the lesson, the reason I wanted to bring this up, is that people make a difference. They make a difference before, they also make a difference after. And back to that idea that it's not about dying, it's about living afterwards and whether you've got a community you want to be in. So what do? I'm not here telling you how to go and get ready for the earthquake. I'm sure there are a lot of resources here that when you want to do it, you can go and find it. I can tell you a bit about what I've chosen to do. Ron talked about me being on TV many years ago, and not so many years ago. I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for over 30 years and just completed my federal service a couple of years ago. I still got my pension even while those people weren't getting paid. But all of my colleagues have been out for the last month. But part of the reason I did this is to be able to focus on how to get the science to people. And I started a nonprofit center and really working with local governments to help them get that mitigation going, because that's what I think is really matters. This isn't at a state or a federal level. This really is a city-by-city effort because we've chosen to protect our communities. We're also working with community organizations, with churches, with schools, because people stay in a region because of what they care about. And I'm also then really trying to help other scientists learn how to bridge that gap between the scientists and policymakers, because we speak in really different ways, and we often aren't really understood. And then the other big thing for me is to start really communicating about climate change, because I've spent my career studying earthquakes. What's coming with climate change scares me. My son is getting his PhD in climate science, and we were talking about it. And he said, Mom, I got the feeling that the more you learn about earthquakes, the less scary they are. And I said, I think that's right. And he said, the more I learn about climate change, the more scary it is. And I think looking forward, it's a big thing of what we're going to have to deal with it about. And if you don't have your own local resources, the 7 Steps to Earthquake Safety from earthquakecountry.org is a lot of good information that you can turn to. I think I'm going to speed through this. Let me see. They told me I could go and change this and move it around. I'm just going to go through really quickly because I don't think we have enough time to talk about another disaster. The 1927 Mississippi floods, Herbert Hoover became president because of how effectively he responded to those floods. I'm only going to take this one moment to say this. But in the process, there was really horrible treatment of the African American refugees that he was party to and he covered up. And he made promises to the African American community about how, if he got president, he would be able to help them. They helped. They did not push too hard to expose the abuses that had gone on. He was indeed elected president in spite of what happened there. But the African American community did not forget what happened. And if you've ever wondered how they went from voting for the party of Lincoln, essentially completely unanimously, to becoming Democrats, it was the rejection of the way Herbert Hoover handled the abuse of the African Americans within that community. And I just said this to remind you that there can be really large political consequences out of how you handle those natural disasters. My last one, this really is, I want to end by looking at the best analogy for what you're facing, looking at what happened in Japan in 2011. That earthquake, hopefully you know that a magnitude 9 can't happen at a point. Earthquakes don't happen at points, they happen over a surface, and the surface in that case was a fault that ran the whole northern half of Honshu Island. Of course, the amount that it slipped was more than had been thought possible and created the tsunami that was several times larger than they expected it to be. And of course, there were almost 18,000 people that died in the tsunami, probably only about 150 in the earthquake itself. So you can build to withstand the earthquake. You've got to get that tsunami right. The reason to bring it up is I got to visit there afterwards and meet a group of women that had come together to help each other as they dealt with recovery from the region. And it's an inspiring picture of what can be done together as a community. One part of it is the Camellia Project, which is being done by the Shinto priestess. Back in 871 AD, there was a previous tsunami in this area. And after the Tohoku event, and it was starting just before Tohoku, it hadn't really gotten around, talked about too much before, recognizing that there had been some plinths that had been put up on the hill, basically, come to here, guys. It was trying to be a message to their descendants. You need to go this high to get out of the tsunami. And it was information that had been forgotten. And so what they are doing in the Camellia Project is planting camellia bushes along a path to define a pathway up to the safe zone. And the idea is to make it a living project that has to be supported by each generation, because camellia plants have to be tended so that they won't forget. But it's also how to bring a piece of beauty to a place that was tortured and bring people back together and being able to stay there. And in fact, okay, so there is something odd in having those in there. This is another city that was hit by the tsunami, and this is their city hall. And they lost their whole city council when the earthquake hit, because their protocol said, go to high ground as soon as you feel the shaking. But there was also a prediction of a 5-meter tsunami, and they knew they had a 6-meter seawall. And they chose to stay. And the tsunami that came in was 14 meters. And it swept through this building, just took out the mayor and almost every city councilor. There were also people standing in the street waiting to hear what they were saying. They tried to escape by going in the building. Vertical evacuation, if you can't get out, go up. And it's the right idea. Unfortunately, this was only a 2-story building, and to get to the roof, there was only one ladder through a trap door. And so it was some people made it to the roof and lived through it. Most of them died. And I bring it up because of what then happened to the city. They no longer had anyone to interact with them for the government. They lost so much. They lost all of their leadership. And they have really struggled to come back. But another one of these women, her name is, oh my God, I've suddenly, Mio Kamatani. And she actually came in after the event as an emergency nurse to help, ended up falling in love with the guy and staying, and is there rebuilding the city. And there again, it's a community that's coming together saying, what is it that we have? And they are offering training programs about how to get through hardship to other parts of Japan. So they're finding what they have good to share out of it, and they're staying together. And of course, the other aspect of that event was, of course, the damage to the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. This is a map showing the exposure of radiation. And when the event happened, at first they only evacuated immediately around the power plant, and then it grew and it grew, and people were moved out from this region to the city of Fukushima. I hope you can see it. There's that little extra orange off to the northwest. So in fact, Fukushima wasn't radiation free, but it also had 300,000 people, and they'd already moved evacuees to that area, and they never did call for an evacuation out of the city of Fukushima. And of course, it's the failure of the power plant that really brought Japan to its knees. And that's another lesson I want to remind you of. It's cascading failures. Just the earthquake is probably going to be okay. What else would be triggered? And what you don't think about. The power plant failed not because of any damage from the earthquake. It failed because the backup power system to run the cooling had generators, and the fuel for those generators was stored below the tsunami level and got washed away. So you got to think about a lot of things when you're trying to pull it together. Those people were brought to this refugee housing in Fukushima City. Many of them ran, they ran with only the clothes on their backs to get out. And they came here and they were measured for radiation, and some of them had the clothes on their backs taken away from them because they had too much radiation exposure. So they really went to nothing. I met a woman named Maki Sahara. This is a picture of her, who had been a stay-at-home housewife taking care of her young child when the earthquake hit. And she was so outraged at the lack of information. She became more and more involved, and she ended up becoming an activist. That big green pile, that's all the topsoil of Fukushima. They ended up going through the city and taking 2 inches of dirt out of every playground, every backyard, every schoolyard, and removing it because of the cesium and other elements that had fallen into it. Piled it up here. She got them, forced them to get, that's a radiation monitor standing in front of it so that they can know what the radiation is and whether or not it ever comes into problems. She also led an effort to get radiation monitors put into the playgrounds so they would know when it's safe for the kids to be there. Imagine having to teach your kids you got to play on concrete, not grass, because the cesium settles into the pockets around the grass. And this is the last lesson. What really is at stake is the future of our communities and how we come together. When I asked Maki what she wanted to tell the world about what had happened, what she said to me, it can be hard even to say it. She said, I want to be able in 20 years to look back and know we did too much to help the children. Because to look back and realize we didn't do enough would be so horrifying. And it's our children probably, or grandchildren, or who knows who's actually going to do with this earthquake. But we need to do enough for them. Thank you.
So we should have time for a few questions, and then Dr. Jones, if you already purchased a book, she'll sign some, and or you may purchase them out in the lobby.
Dr. Jones, thank you very much for coming. It's really very important. I went through the Loma Prieta earthquake, and that has really screwed my life. But one of the things it did was it taught me to get as much information out as possible. Right now, we have the Cascadia playbook out. It's just come out. It's a working draft. And what it does is it addresses the time scale and who's responsible for what and how you can help them.
Great. Planning, even if the plan might turn out to be useless, planning is essential, and that means all of us being part of the planning process.
This is probably a loaded question around here. What do you think about putting LNG? What do you think about putting an LNG terminal right here in Coos Bay on the subductive zone?
Yeah, you're right, loaded question. I'm going to answer it generally because I know no details about your plant or the proposal. If you take the risk completely seriously, you can build to be safe. Unfortunately, often the way it is done and what is accepted is a probabilistic assessment of what it will be that says, well, this is the mean value. This is on average what you get here, so this is what we'll design for. And an engineer I know has said what we should be doing is saying, what outcome is unacceptable, and what do we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen? And obviously, an explosion of an LNG facility during an earthquake would be unacceptable. What's necessary to build it in a way that that won't happen? Oh.
So, right here, the PBS had a special about a month and a half ago on the Alaskan earthquake and how it affected everything there. Right. And it was surprising to hear more information about how people moved away from the various areas and how they were impacted by that. And it's interesting how that would be a comparison to what would happen here, in a sense.
Well, okay, so you mean the Alaska earthquake, yeah. In 64, not the most recent one, yeah. What I'll point out about the most recent one, if you notice there was like no damage, that's because the building code says they need to build for the 9.2, a stronger level of shaking, and therefore when they had the 7 with a lower level of shaking, even though it was closer, there was essentially no damage. So this is another aspect. Our building code says crawl out alive. When something is built to code for your magnitude 9, that's to make sure the building doesn't kill you. If it's a total financial loss, that was your choice to make. We are intentionally building disposable buildings. So, and to the degree we do that, that makes it that much harder for people to come back. Now, of course, in 64, they weren't building for the earthquakes really at all. And a lot of things were badly destroyed, and of course, with the tsunami wiping out areas. You know, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. When you look over history at what has happened, people come back if there's a reason to. You know, you know, they're still planting crops on the sides of Mount Vesuvius because it's the best cropland there is. And that's the same sort of thing here, is what's going to make it worth coming back. And you know, can you get out and, you know, vertical evacuation, all of these different pieces together, you can make a sustainable community, but you have to think about it, and it's not just having kids.
I was in the 1964 earthquake as a child. I was 12. And we worked real hard afterwards, taking care of each other and all the ways that people needed to be taken care of. And sharing what we had, and then making plans about strengthening our communities. I was on the Kenai Peninsula in Sterling. But strengthening the communities and building better homes you know, in different ways, so that if those things happened again, we wouldn't be at so much risk of losing everything and everyone.
Thank you. That's one of the other, you know, one of the things that happened in Anchorage last year is not only did you have a stronger building standard, the really bad buildings have been wiped out in '64. And that's another thing to remember. No building code in the world is retroactive. And your building code is as good as the code that was in place at the time it was built and the degree to which it was enforced. And we see the biggest life safety issue in older buildings.
Oh. People put their hands up too. Yeah, I know, except that there are some folks out there on the live
as well,
stream.
so we want to capture the question.
Making you run, sorry. What about the stability of the Hawaiian Islands?
Yes. Eventually, there will be flank failures on the Hawaiian Islands. As the volcano keeps on growing up and growing up, at some point it becomes stable and things settle. That is what just happened in Indonesia with Anak Krakatoa, the child of Krakatoa. So it's a second volcano that grew within the caldera that exploded in 1883. It had a flank failure, and that caused the tsunami. And they said, oh, the tsunami without warning, because it was a flank failure. It wasn't an earthquake with a lot of seismic energy. Yes, at some point it will happen. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it because the return time's something like once every 50,000 years. Now, there's a lot of other, you know, it is random. So with all of the, the sociologists talk about finite pools of worry. You can only get people worrying about so many things. And in that finite pool, it's a low enough probability it doesn't really usually make it into my pool. Okay. It actually causes a big tsunami. It's about the only big tsunami to come into Southern California. Comes off the flank of the Hawaiian Islands. Yeah.
Hi, and thanks again for your speech tonight. But this area isn't like a big community, you know, with everything kind of compacted into one river basin or something like that. This is an area that is covered with bridges, most of which were made before Abraham Lincoln was alive. And they are constantly going under, you know, little repairs for this and that to get them by, but in no way are they up to standards for, maybe there are just a few of them that do come up to earthquake standards, but we all ought to bear in mind that if a big quake hits this area, we're going to have, you know, 1,200 communities up and down the coast that are going to be totally isolated. And, you know, and we live in Coquille, and we, you know, if we need, you know, the only hospital that will be available to us is the Coquille Hospital. You know, ambulances are not going to be running intercity. And because these bridges go over the plethora of streams. So that's something to really plan for.
Clearly that's something to plan for. I'd also point out that if you ever had a government bond being proposed to put money into strengthening bridges, you'd have a lot to benefit by doing that.
Hi, Lucy.
We can make those choices, yes.
On one of your maps, the global warming map, I noticed there was a section of time from 1940 to 1980 where the temperature did not rise much. It just kept going up and down. And then after 1980, it went up to the present time. Why do you think that happened?
Random. I mean, there are various processes. Given that I'm not an atmospheric physicist, I wouldn't try to come up with detailed ones in there. But I think that idea that, there are a variety of processes in the natural environment that trade off, that affect the global climate. We've had many ice ages in the past. And in fact, those cycles are such that one would expect us to be going cooler right now. And I think that part of that is if you've put in this, you've got a natural process that's trying to do this, and then you add the extra heating from the extra carbon onto it, you'll get a sum that'll be flat for a while. And so how those different processes are playing out is complex. And when I look at it, given that I don't research those processes myself, I'm looking at it more from a social and as a disaster scientist and what it's doing. Whatever the hell the cause is, it is happening. And whatever the cause is, the more carbon we put into the atmosphere, the worse we make it. I think that's what we're seeing is not just a human caused process, but that human process is adding to it. And we know that if we remove the carbon, we'll reduce it.
So I'd like to take 1 second. I'd like to thank the college for hosting us in this hall, our IT department, not only for dealing with us in here, but also the live stream. I would like to thank the SWOCC Foundation. I'd like to thank DB Western. I'd like to thank the Mill, all of our sponsors. And I also would heartfelt thanks to Lucy Jones for putting us into her schedule. If you found the talk as dynamic and engaging as I did, and you are interested, books will be available out in the lobby.
The rest of those stories that I gave you.
And Dr. Jones will be signing those as well. So it takes a village, it takes a community, and I appreciate the community that comes out regularly to attend these lectures, because you are the other sponsor as well. So thank you all. Be sure if you've got an old schedule, the next talk has been postponed 2 weeks to March 16th. Go ahead and grab yourself a new schedule to throw on your fridge. Enjoy this beautiful weekend, and thank you again for making the trip.